Parashat Lech Lechah, the weekly Torah portion, meaning go for yourself. Bereshit or Genesis 12 verse 1 to 17:27. Topic 1. The basic story here is about the patriarch Abram and his relationship to his family and also to the land of Israel.
ויאמר אדוני אל אברהם, לך לך מארצך וממולדתך ומבית אביך אל הארץ אשר אראך.
Lech Lechah literally means go for yourself.
לך לך.
Without the vowel points, these two words look alike, but they are not. Lech means go as a command form. Lechah means for yourself. In Genesis chapter 12 verse 1, God tells Abram to go for himself from his country Ur. God also tells Abram to leave his extended family and also to leave his father's house. Now this might appear to be stated backwards. Normally, when you are going somewhere, you first leave your house, then your relatives in the village, and then after that you might leave your country. But this was a hard thing which God was asking Abram to do. He had to leave all his old life behind, and he did not even know where he was going. And so, God made it easier for him by telling him, first, to leave his country. It's quite easy to leave your country. Then he told him to leave his relatives. It's harder to leave your relatives, your neighbors and friends. Then he told him to leave his house. It's the hardest of all to leave your house, in other words, to leave what is most familiar to you. Topic 2. Abram in the early years. From flax to linen. Abram was the only man of faith living at the time. The Jewish sages tell us. Beginning now and over the next few years, Abram had to go through 10 major tests of his faith. We will discuss some of these tests in this parasha, but this begs the question as to why God allowed him to go through these tests. After all, he was already the most holy and faithful man in the world. This is shown in the example of Egyptian linen, which is known as the best quality in the world. But nevertheless, the people who work with it have to beat it in order to bring out its best qualities. As they beat it, it opens up and becomes much better for spinning. If they were to beat an inferior brand of linen in such a way, then it would just fall apart and be revealed as a poor quality which was of no use. God wanted to use Abram, and he wanted to be sure that he would be the best. Therefore, he put him through some very severe tests. Topic 3. Creation with Abraham in mind. Linked to this idea that God wanted to use Abram, the thought in Genesis chapter 2 verse 4 where part of the verse says, when they were created. When they were created is often interpreted to mean in the process of their creation, or by means of their creation. It comes from the verb bara, which means to create. However, as a play on words, you could say that it also means for the sake of Abram. In other words, we can say that Torah is telling us that God created the earth and the heavens because of Abram's virtues, such as his kindness and grace. Topic 4. Stories of Abram. In Genesis chapter 12 verse 4 we read that Abram was 75 years old when God asked him to leave his house and go to an unknown place. It is not unreasonable to ask what happened in Abram's life before this. The Torah does not give us much detail on this. However, we have just noted that God chose Abram. If he chose him for such an important task, it implies that he has confidence in him, and therefore it doesn't really matter what he had done in his life up until then. Just as God chose Abram, God chose those stories which he wanted us to hear. It is also valid to point out that, with our limited human understanding, even if we know a lot of detail, we can often find it difficult to see the whole picture of what God is doing at any particular time. Therefore, we have to take a lot of it by faith, which is what Abram also had to do. However, what we do know is that God considered Abram to be a real Jew. This real Jew is someone who will obey God without questioning him. This is important because the Jewish faith does not really work according to logic. The early days of Judaism are full of miraculous events which the natural mind cannot explain, hence the need to follow God without questioning him. For example, Abram had a son Isaac when he was well past the age of being physically able. The same is true of Sarai, his wife, who was also well beyond the age of childbearing. One other story which is widely known about Abram's early years is that Abram lived with his father Terah. Now Terah was a potter who made clay idols and who sold these idols in his own shop. And this was a profitable enterprise because Erkasdim was a well-known center of idolatry. Now Abram, even though he had been brought up in this community of idol worshippers, was having big doubts about it all. In fact, unlike everyone else, he was leaning strongly towards faith in one God, and the idolatry was causing him a lot of grief. The story goes that one day, Terah left Abram in charge of the shop, selling the idols. A man walked in and wished to buy an idol. Abram asked him how old he was, and the man responded, 50 years old. Abram then said, "You are 50 years old, and yet you would worship a statue which I made yesterday?" At this point the man left, embarrassed by the truth of what Abram had said. Later, a woman walked into the shop with a large plate of food, in order to make an offering to the idols. After she had gone, Abram took a hammer and smashed all the idols except the largest one. Then he placed the hammer in the hand of the largest idol. When Terah returned, he asked Abram what had happened to all the idols. Abraham told him that a woman came in to make an offering to the idols. After she had left, the idols argued about which one should eat the offering first. Then the largest idol took the hammer and smashed all the others. Terah responded by saying that this was impossible. They were only statues and they had no knowledge. And anyway, they could not move. Whereupon Abram responded by saying, "You deny they have any knowledge and you even deny their ability to move, and yet you worship them." At this point, Terah took Abram to Nimrod to complain about what his son had done. Now Nimrod was the ruler of nearby Babylon, and he was a big idol worshipper. He became very upset that Abram had destroyed the idols. He proclaimed to Abram that, "We worship fire." And he also declared that Abram should be cast into a furnace. Note that the name of the town translates as fire in Hebrew. Mockingly, he said that if Abram was correct, and there was a real God, then that God would surely save him from the fire. Abram was cast into a furnace and was saved by God. Incidentally, the Babylonian guards which put him in the fire were burned up by its heat. 10 days later, it was all too apparent to Nimrod that Abram had not died in the fire. God had spared him and he was still alive. So Nimrod sent some more guards to pull him out. But they were also burned up by the heat of the furnace. Abram and his God had a victory over Nimrod and his idolatry. However, this victory would later have consequences for Lot, who was Abram's nephew. Topic 5. Lot and Nimrod. But nevertheless the people who work with it have to beat it in order to bring out its best qualities. As they beat it, it opens up and becomes much better for spinning. If they were to beat an inferior brand of linen in such a way, then it would just fall apart and be revealed as a poor quality which was of no use. How was this? Basically, Genesis chapter 13 verse 2 says that Abram had much livestock, silver and gold. There was great material wealth to squabble over. Now, in Genesis chapter 13 verse 5, Lot had flocks, cattle and tents. Why is the Torah telling us this detail? We can understand livestock, flocks, cattle, and even silver and gold. But why does it mention Lot's tents? In that economy, everyone had a tent. There was normally nothing special about having a tent. But the answer is that a tent was a man's house, and his wife would be living there, and Lot's wife would turn out to be a very special woman, although she did not know it. She and Lot had 2 daughters, and eventually after the destruction of Sodom, and after the death of Lot's wife, both the daughters plied Lot with wine to make him drunk, so that he would lie with them, and they would have the opportunity to bring forth life. This is described in Genesis chapter 19 verses 33 to 38. People have wondered about this incestuous behavior, but the dilemma they were facing was as follows. They had heard about the flood which had destroyed everything not so long ago. And here was the destruction of Sodom. For all they knew, they imagined that God had destroyed the whole world again, and therefore they and their father were the sole survivors. Hence the impulse to have children with their own father, the only male alive. Another interesting point is the wine. Let us also consider where this wine came from. Lot and his daughters were living in a cave. God was the one who arranged for them to obtain this wine in order to facilitate their plan. In time, the elder daughter bore a son, and she called him Moav, which means, from the father in Hebrew. And many generations later, Ruth came from the land of Moab, and she was the grandmother of King David, who is in turn an ancestor of our Mashiach. And so the importance of Lot's tent was that, in a certain sense, Mashiach was in that tent. The Hebrew word Lot is spelled Lamed, Vav, Tet. This has a gematria value of 45. The word Lot itself means a curtain, as in a curtain in front of the stage at the theater. When you lift it up, something will be revealed. Incidentally, the Hebrew word Adam is spelled Aleph, Dalet, Mem. It also has a gematria value of 45. Is the word Adam also about to reveal something to us? The answer is yes. Adam itself contains a message in its 3 letters, which are, let us recall, Aleph, Dalet, Mem. Aleph stands for Adam himself, Dalet stands for David, and Mem stands for Mashiach, the history of Israel in a name. And many generations later, Ruth came from the land of Moab, and she was the grandmother of King David, who is in turn an ancestor of our Mashiach. And so the importance of Lot's tent was that, in a certain sense, Mashiach was in that tent. Topic 6. World War. And finally, let us consider the War of the Kings, also known as the First World War. This is described in Genesis chapter 14 verses 1 to 12. And it involved 4 kings on one side, and 5 kings on the other side. This was the biggest war thus far in human history, and that is the reason it is sometimes called the First World War. With all due respect to what occurred between 1914 and 1918, it is the 4 kings who are victorious because they are the stronger side. The first mentioned king is Amraphel, king of Shinar, and this is the same man as Nimrod. Amraphel is his Hebrew name, and it means fall down. This is what he had said to Abram when he had him placed in the furnace. And Nimrod dwelt in Babel, and he there renewed his reign over the rest of his subjects. And he reigned securely, and the subjects and princes of Nimrod called his name Amraphel, saying that at the tower his princes and men fell through his means. Sefer Hayashar 11. Genesis Rabbah 42 says Amraphel was called by 3 names. Cush, after his father's name, Genesis 10 verse 8. Nimrod because he established rebellion in the world, and Amraphel, as he declared a mar. I will cast down a pillar. Nimrod is his Babylonian name, and it means, let's make revolution. That is, let us make a revolution against God. This is why godly Jewish men will never name their son Nimrod. As part of the spoils of their victory in this war, the four kings captured the city of Sodom. In this way, Lot, who was living in Sodom at this time, fell into the hands of Nimrod, who remembered Abram, and who still wanted revenge for Abram's victory over him years ago when the latter had survived the furnace. So what Nimrod plotted to do now is to use Lot to undermine Abram's victory. Nimrod had noticed that Lot had a strong family resemblance to Abram, so he intended to dress him up as Abram, and then parade him around various cities, making him claim that Abram's furnace victory was not real, and that it had just been a trick. In this way, Nimrod was maybe the first man to consider broadcasting fake news. Abram learned about Lot's capture from Og, king of Bashan. He is the fugitive referred to in Genesis chapter 14 verse 13. He is called this because he survived the war between the 4 kings and the 5 kings. And incidentally, the Jewish sages say that he is also the only man apart from Noah and his family to have survived the flood. He did this by stowing away on the outside of the ark. Apparently Og has a devious motive for informing Abram about Lot. This is because he wants Abram to attempt to rescue Lot, and he believes that Abram will probably die in the attempt. And if this happens, he will be free to pursue Sarai with a view to marriage and making her his queen. In spite of his devious motivation, God gave Og a long life for his good deed in informing Abram about Lot. However, because of this devious motivation, God would later allow Og to fall into the hands of Abram's descendants. And it was Moses who killed him in Numbers chapter 21 verses 33 to 35. And so, Abram does save Lot, and he does so for 2 reasons. One is that Abram is a righteous man, and therefore Abram's family is important to him, even though Lot had previously walked out on him and gone to live in Sodom. The second reason why Abram would come to save Lot was that he discerned what we said previously, that Mashiach was there in Lot's loins through Ruth the Moabite. Topic 7. Conclusion. So finally, what conclusions can we draw from Abram's life as portrayed in Lech Lechah? First, God chooses people to follow him, and sometimes these people emerge from the most unlikely places and from the most unlikely backgrounds. Abram is an example of this, coming, as he did, from a family of idol worshippers. But when he does choose someone, let us not be lacking in faith, just because we don't know everything about their previous life. Secondly, the same can be said about the people God chooses to use in his plan. Sometimes they also come from the most unlikely places, and also from the most unlikely backgrounds. Consider Lot, and then consider his descendant, Ruth. Thirdly, God will back up the man who lives by faith. Consider how God spared Abram right in the middle of a furnace. Number 4, we should pursue the will of God, even if there appears to be danger. He will be there to help us in our battle situations, and also in our furnace situations. Number 5, if we are ever in a situation dealing with unbelievers and their idolatry, God can give us wisdom as to how to answer them. And, like Abram, we might have to even go against members of our own families. Number 6, God's plan is wrapped up in the family of the patriarch Abram, as God himself stated in Genesis chapter 12 verse 2. This family will one day lead to the establishment of the nation of Israel. And then through King David, Israel's greatest king, one day Mashiach will come.